Well, let's return now to those protests in Melbourne where Hezbollah flags were flown in the streets.
Joining us now is Liberal MP Julian Leeser. Julian, thanks for your time. I've got to ask you, were you surprised to see people openly advocating for a terrorist organisation in our CBDs at the weekend?
James, sadly, I wasn't surprised. I wish I could say I was, but I wasn't. We've seen a year of this sort of behaviour since the 7th of October. It's almost a year. We saw it first at the Sydney Opera House on the 9th of October. We're seeing it in Melbourne and in Sydney this week with people with terrorist flags, holding pictures of Hassan Nasrallah as if you're some sort of hero rather than the terrorist that we in our own country declare him to be. This is just terrible, and it's the product of the failure of leadership that we have seen from Labor governments at the state and federal level. What is the point of having this suite of counter-terrorism laws which makes support for a terrorist organisation, including the flying of a terrorist flag, illegal if that law is not being enforced? It's time our state and federal Labor political leaders said to the authorities, enforce the law.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes it redundant, really, if you're not going to enforce the law properly. It's just ridiculous.
Exactly.
We heard as well earlier from the President of the Islamic Council on Victoria saying that Hezbollah supporters are, quote, definitely a minority, an absolute tiny minority. And he went on to say this is all about support for the Lebanese people. Does that allay any of your concerns?
I wish it did. It doesn't in any way. I mean, I want to see a Lebanon that is free of foreign interference, a Lebanon that's at peace with its neighbours, as we all do. But what we're seeing on the streets are people supporting a terrorist organisation, actively chanting pro-Hezbollah slogans, holding a picture of the leader of Hezbollah, which Australia decided was a terrorist organisation. It's worthwhile revisiting why we decided it was a terrorist organisation, because Hezbollah is a threat to Australian interest and it's a threat to broader Western interests, and it uses political violence as a means for getting change, both in Israel, in Lebanon and more broadly. And the fact that we've got Australian citizens and others standing and supporting a terrorist organisation on our own streets is a national shame, and it is time that we got tough on people who are doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you about Penny Wong at the United Nations. She's advocating for a two-state solution. She's calling on Israel to follow the rules of war, even when dealing with terrorists. How do you feel about her address to the United Nations? And is she making any good points, or is she just completely wrong on every score?
Well, look, I go back to before the last election when senior Labor figures wrote in the Jewish News that there would be no difference between Labor and the coalition on Israel. That remains the biggest lie that has ever been told in the history of Australian politics, in my view, because right from the time Labor was elected, we have seen them backsliding on support for Israel, whether that has been changing the capital, changing votes at the United Nations, funding UNRWA. And what we've seen from Penny Wong in recent days and in recent months is the byproduct of decades of resolutions within the Labor Party that have become increasingly anti-Israel. And there are people sitting around that Labor cabinet table that just have it in for Israel more broadly. And that's why in the middle of all of this terrorist activity that Israel is trying to defend itself against, you've got the Labor Party not backing a Western democratic ally, but setting instead a timetable for a peace process without putting preconditions on people in the Palestinian organisations to actually recognise the right of Israel to exist. That's always been the bipartisan policy of Australia in relation to Israel and Palestine, and yet this government has thrown that out the door. It is weakening our relationship with a democratic ally, and it sends a very bad signal to other democratic allies right around the world about Australian policy not being based on fundamental values, but being based more on Graindler than on Gaza.
Great point.
Yeah, it certainly is very concerning. I want to ask you about the former Chief Executive of Westfield Corporation, Steve Lowy. Now, he's told the Australian newspaper, and I'll quote, "I am concerned and very sad that Australia is now sleepwalking into a period of extremist politics and a social spiral." Now, he's singled out the government and institutions such as universities, for example, for abdicating leadership on the state of the country since October 7. I'm sure you would agree with him there. What I want to ask you is, though, how do we get to a point where moral clarity, let alone moral courage, is so lacking? I mean, you spoke about leadership just a moment ago, but how did we get to this point?
Well, I know Stephen Lowy name-checked a whole bunch of former Labor leaders and even name-checked the Premier of New South Wales, Chris Minns, as people who've done well. He didn't name-check Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, Mark Dreyfus or Tony Burke, who are responsible, actually, in this country for issues around social cohesion and ensuring that anti-Semitism is actually addressed. And I think this has occurred more broadly because people are not prepared to stand up to noisy minorities. And whether that's the noisy woke green left or whether it's Islamists in our country, people just need to stand up for what's right. It's not that difficult, and you will find when you stand up for what's right, a whole bunch of people will come and back you. We don't see enough of that in Australia today, unfortunately, and Steve Lowy's right.
Yeah.